supply and the venous drainage of the central nervous system. Now, the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. So you need to understand what is the blood supply to the brain and the spinal cord. We understood a bit when we are talking about head and neck, but in head and neck, you only concentrated on the exterior part, not really the brain and the spinal cord, but just about the general structure of the outer supply. Example, the face, the neck. But here is the brain itself. So start with the blood supply to the brain. There's blood circulation to the brain. You have got the arterial supply and the venous drainage. The arterial supply is via two systems of arteries. You have got the carotid system coming from the internal carotid, and then you have got the vertebrobasilar, okay, which is coming from the basilar artery. So these two are important, the carotid and the vertebrobasilar. The venous drainage, the deep structures will be able to drain into the durovenous sinuses, and we did discuss that when we talked about the head and neck. And then the superficial structures will drain in the veins, the superior cerebral vein, medial cerebral, and the inferior cerebral. Okay. So as we said, we have got too many arteries that to be supplying the brain. You have got the vertebral arteries and the internal carotid. The vertebral arteries, you have got two vertebral arteries, one from the left and one from the right. Okay. And the vertebral arteries are, where do they come from? These guys come from the subclavian artery. Now, depending with which side of the body you're talking about, this is the arc of the aorta. The first branch of the arc of the aorta is the brachiocephalic. Brachiocephalic is going to give you the right common carotid. And you also have the right subclavian. So from the right subclavian, that's where you have got the right vertebral artery. And then again from the arc of the aorta, you have got the next branch is the left common carotid and then the left subclavian. The left subclavian again will give you the left vertebral. Okay. And you can see these guys are passing in the intervertebral foramen. They are going to the brain. These guys are supplying the posterior part of the brain. What you supply the anterior part of the brain, you can see what is remaining. The common carotid is remaining. Common carotid will bifurcate into the internal carotid and the external carotid. The internal carotid is the one that will end up going now to supply the anterior part. So that guy, the internal carotid will actually give you the anterior cerebral artery and also the one that is on the middle cerebral. And then the vertebral artery will give you the posterior cerebral, which is supplying the back of the brain. Okay. So the vertebral arteries from the left and the right, you can see the way they are going. These ones are the back. They are going to end up joining and they'll form one artery, which we call the basilar artery. Then that basilar artery will end up joining with the internal carotid, and that will form the arterial circle of Willis. This is just a side view again of the same thing we're talking about. Even here, so you can see posterior you have got the vertebral arteries going up. The vertebral arteries again going up. They are going to join the one from the left and from the right. You now form the basilar artery. And you can see anteriorly you have got the internal carotid. These two guys are going to come and join at the base of the brain, forming the arterial circle of Willis. And you can even see some branches that will come out from the arterial circle of Willis. Ophthalmic artery, you have got the anterior cerebral, the middle cerebral, and then the posterior cerebral. But take note that the posterior cerebral is coming from the basilar, the anterior and middle is coming from the internal carotid. When you look at the internal carotid itself, it has got four parts. And I think you did talk about the four parts when talking about head and neck. That's not our interest here. But you have got when it is formed from the common carotid, the internal carotid, the first part that's found in the neck is the cervical. And then you are going to have the part that is found on the petrous part of the temporal bone, that is the petrous part. And then one that will pass in the cavernous sinus, which is a big vein, that will be the cavernous part. And then the part that will be found at the base of the brain, that will be the cerebral part. Okay. So now, what are the branches of the internal carotid that supply the brain? So the internal carotid is this guy that you can see. Now in this view, it is not so interesting, but you need to know this picture here. Okay. Please forget about what's down. The internal carotid is what you can see on top. I hope you can see where my cursor is. Okay. The entire of this thing on top, except these two lines here, the posterior communicating. So these big parts. Of course, the posterior communicating is part of the internal carotid. So what are the parts of the internal carotid? Let's start from the posterior communicating itself, this one. The internal carotid is the one that you can see medial. The branches it has, you have got going behind the posterior communicating, going in front. In front, we have got what we call the anterior cerebral. Now, the anterior cerebral continues like this, and then it will continue going forward, even the one on the left. So the anterior cerebral has got A1 and A2. A1 is the one that's found at the beginning. A2 is the one that will continue forward like that. The two anterior cerebral arteries are connected by what we call the anterior communicating artery. And then from the internal carotid again, you also have got a branch, this one that is in front, which is going to the eye. We call that as the ophthalmic artery. And then you also have this big artery coming from the side. We call that as a middle cerebral artery. Okay. And then you have got also this small one. It's like a bit posterior. We call it the anterior choroidal. There's no posterior choroidal here, just anterior choroidal. So these are the five branches which will be supplying the anterior part of the brain. Now, all the branches except the ophthalmic is supplying the orbit. The rest of the parts will supply the anterior part of the brain. Okay, so that is the cerebral branches of the internal carotid. Hope we are okay with that one. The next is now going to be the basilar artery. The basilar artery is formed from a fusion or a joining of the two vertebral arteries, one on the left, one on the right. So if you again look on this picture, this is the the right vertebral. This is the left vertebral. When they join, they will give you the basilar artery. So what are the branches coming from here? Number one, from just the vertebral arteries themselves, you have got an anterior spinal artery. Now, the anterior spinal artery is getting a branch from the left vertebral, the right vertebral, and then coming on the mid. You only have one anterior cerebral artery. And then you have got cerebellar arteries. So you have got what we call posterior inferior cerebellar artery, PICA or PICA. Posterior inferior cerebellar arteries come from the vertebral artery. And then just a bit on top, okay, where after the formation of the basilar, you are having what we call the anterior inferior cerebellar arteries, AICA. So the inferior part of the cerebellum is supplied by two arteries because the inferior part of the cerebellum is big. The superior part of the cerebellum is small. So the superior part is only supplied by one branch. Think of the base, right? Ichirimba, okay, when it is sitting down. But think of something that goes like a pyramid. The base is very big, but as you go up, it becomes smaller. That's how the cerebellum is. The base is big, so it needs two arteries. The top is small. So ICA comes from the basilar artery, while PICA comes from the vertebral arteries. On top of PICA, we have got these two small branches, which we call the pontine branches. They're supplying the pons. And then just on top, you have got now the superior cerebellar artery. Immediately after the superior cerebellar artery, you have got the posterior cerebral. So remember, the posterior cerebral is coming from the basilar artery. The anterior cerebral and the middle cerebral is coming from the internal carotid, including posterior communicating. Posterior communicating is coming from the internal carotid, but the posterior cerebral, okay, is coming from the basilar artery. I hope that's okay. If we are okay so far, let me just see people reacting. You can use any emoji on your screen to react. We see if we are okay. Okay, excellent. So, what are the branches of the basilar artery? Anterior inferior cerebellar, which is ICA, and then you also have, so you have got from ICA. Sometimes you have got from ICA this artery which we call labyrinthine. Okay, now the labyrinthine artery, labyrinth is referring to structures in the ear. So these guys will supply the auditory or the internal auditory uh, 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 portion. It's going to the ears. You love it when we discuss the ear. I'll be able to draw it instead of using a picture so you understand it better. When you look at the ear, it has got two parts. There is the part that is involved in hearing, that's the auditory part, and then there's a part that is involved in balance, that's a vestibular part. So that's why the cranial nerve number 8, we call it vestibulocochlear. The cochlea is involved in hearing, okay, auditory, while the vestibular apparatus is involved in balance. What makes up the vestibular apparatus? So we have got the parts we call the sulcus and the utricles, and then we have got the semicircular canals. But forget about that for now. Just know that we have got the cochlea, which is involved in hearing and is supplied by the labyrinthine artery. Sometimes this guy comes from ICA, sometimes it comes from the basilar artery. So take note of that. Okay, that's why here you can see it's put as a branch of the basilar, but sometimes it can come from ICA. And then you have got the pontine branches, and then you have got superior cerebellar artery, okay, superior cerebellar. And then you have got two terminal posterior cerebral arteries. Remember, the cerebral ones come from the basilar, the posterior ones. So this is how this structure is. To just orient you, down you are supposed to have a spinal cord, and then as you are going up, you have got a medulla oblongata, and then you have got the pons. On top, you are going to have the midbrain. So you can see the vertebral arteries, two of them, and then they're giving you a branch here, which is the anterior spinal. And then again, you're having two branches coming out from the sides, that is posterior inferior cerebellar, that's pica, to supply the cerebellum. And then on top, just after these two join to form the basilar, you have got the ica. But can you see sometimes you are first going to have the labyrinthine coming out from there, okay? And then ica will be on top. But take note that labyrinthine can come from ica. And then you have got the pontine branches which are supplying the pons here. And then after the pontine, you have got superior cerebellar. Please take note, this is first cerebellar. The cerebellar, we call it superior. And then you have got cerebral. The cerebral is posterior. Posterior cerebral. And then you have got this guy, which is, you are going to have the posterior communicating. This is part of the internal carotid. Okay. And then you have got now, the internal carotid itself is shown medially. And then remember, like on the posterior aspect, that's where you have got the anterior choroid coming out. And then you have got going laterally the middle cerebral, and then going in front, that is going to be the the anterior cerebral, not cerebellar, cerebral. And then you are also going to have the ophthalmic arteries coming also from this same internal carotid. Can you see that from the mid to just anterior here, from the anterior cerebral, we also have an artery which we call the recurrent artery of Hebner, which has got a medial which will give the medial striate artery. It's an important one for you to know, but for now you can forget if you want. If they ask you to draw the internal carotid artery, what are you going to include in your drawing? You are going to first draw two lines, they meet on the middle. Label those two lines the vertebral arteries, remove two and then join on the middle to form the anterior spinal, and then also show coming from the vertebral arteries pica, and then just like on the junction also show ica. You can show the labyrinthine, just show it coming from ica, or you can show it coming from bacilla, and then also show the pontine branches, and then on top of the pontine branches of course superior cerebella, and then posterior cerebral, and then show the posterior communicating. Just draw a circle here, okay, a circle. That circle represents the internal carotid. And then draw a circle here. From the circles, go and connect in front. That will be anterior cerebral. And then remember to continue straight going up so that on the middle where those two anterior cerebrals are connected, that will be the anterior communicating. And then the circle that we are going to draw here, draw an artery that will come out from the side. That will be the middle cerebral, and then draw a Kamatia that will be going behind, that will be the anterior choroidal, and then a Kamatia that will be going in front, that will be the ophthalmic. You have drawn the arterial circle of Willis, you get your 10 marks, right? So we've talked about all the branches that will form the anterior circle of Willis. So this circle is also known as the loop of Willis, or the cerebral arterial circle, or Willis polygon. It was described by Thomas Willis, that's why it's called the arterial circle of Willis. Okay, you can see the part of the brain where it's found. The arterial circle of Willis is actually rounding. You are on at this point where I'm pointing. You have got what we call the optic chiasm. When you look at our eyes, for you to be able to see, you have got cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve. So the optic nerve carries information from what we call visual fields. And again, we will discuss this very much as we'll be talking about the special senses in neurophysiology. So the left side of the eye, let me just say the left side of the eye, yes, okay, it is going to have two branches of the optic nerve. One is carrying information that is saying things medially, another one is carrying information that is saying things laterally. And then those arteries, when they continue going, they are going to meet, okay, just at this point here. And then some of the branches that were coming from the left side of the eye will go to the right side of the brain. Some branches will still remain on the right side. Some of the branches that are coming from the left, will turn and go to the right, but some of them will still remain on the left. It's important for you to understand that. That's why if there is an injury to the nerve itself, you'll be seeing different kinds of blindness. So we'll discuss those later on when you talk about the topic. So when you look at the three cerebral arteries that we described, we said we have got anterior, the middle, and the posterior. So you need to know which parts they supply. The anterior, if so, these pictures A and B are showing us the supply of the external parts, okay, the cortical areas, the cortex. So you can see the middle part of the brain going anteriorly and reaching, so you are covering also part of the frontal lobe, but we are not going to the parietal lobe because here we are going to have a sulcus here, the central sulcus. So this part is being supplied by the anterior cerebral. Majority of the brain is supplied by the middle cerebral. You can see the entire of this area. And I want you to remember we did discuss this when you're talking about the topography of the central nervous system. We talked about the front part of the brain the frontal uh, area is mostly going to control our cognitive function, right? The way we will be thinking and our motor aspects, because we have got the motor area in front here. And then behind the central sulcus, this come a line that you can see, that's the central sulcus. You are going to have the somatosensory area. This controls our sensations. And then the parietal, this area that you can see is the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe contains what we call the Wernicke's area that allows you to speak. The frontal lobe, the one in front, also contains what we call Broca's area that allows you to speak. The difference between Broca's is in front, it helps you to speak. But Wernicke's, which is found in the temporal, helps you to understand language. So it means that if there's an injury to the mid cerebral artery, you are going to have difficulties in understanding language. So you are going to have what we call Wernicke's aphasia, okay, because there is no blood supply to this area. You can see the posterior cerebral artery supplying the occipital lobe of the brain. The occipital lobe is important in vision. That tells you that if there is an injury to the posterior cerebral artery, or if there's an occlusion, or there's an emboli that has formed and then it occludes the posterior cerebral artery, you can't see, okay, because the posterior cerebral artery supplies occipital lobe, which is responsible for vision. This one is showing us now the deep in structures that are supplied. Can you see that the medial aspect of the brain internally is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery? And again, we did discuss when we're talking about the topography of the central nervous system, the topography of the central nervous system, to say the anterior part of the brain here controls the lower limb. So that will tell you that if there is an injury to the anterior cerebral artery, you don't have supply on the medial aspect that controls the lower limb. So the lower limb is going to be affected. The legs, there's going to be problem with the legs. And then you can see this big part here is being supplied by the middle cerebral artery, and then the inferior part is being supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Again, I'll ask, are we okay? If we are okay, please let me just see some reactions. If we're not okay, please be free to ask. Are we, sorry, can you just say that again? Okay, so it's the lower limb. When you look at, I just didn't include the picture for the homunculus, but the medial part here is what controls the lower limb. Okay, the middle part, which is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. So if there's an injury to the anterior cerebral artery, it means that the lower limb is going to be affected. Is that okay? All right. So again, you can see ICA is supplying this medial part, and then not ICA but ACA, totally different. ICA is something different. And then you have got PICA. Again, I'm saying PICA, not PICA, PICA. That's different. Okay, this is a posterior cerebral. You can see it's supplying this medial part, and it's also supplying this inferior part. The anterior choroidal, you can also say it's supplying the area between the area being supplied by the two posterior cerebral arteries, and then you have got the middle cerebral artery supplying the majority of this place. And the middle cerebral artery contains the superior division and also the inferior division. Okay, you can see this is an MRI that is showing the different areas that are being supplied. The one in blue is the medial, frontal, and parietal lobes. So these guys have been supplied by the anterior cerebral. The one in green down here, that is via the posterior cerebral. The one in red is the middle cerebral. Then you have got the area that is in yellow, that is by the anterior choroidal. You can see the anterior cerebral supplies the anterior aspect of the brain, posterior cerebral the posterior aspect. So what are the branches of the anterior cerebral? You don't really need to know, but just know that the anterior cerebral supply is giving these branches the orbitofrontal, that is supplying the frontal lobe, the frontopolar, you have got the callosomarginal, Cala this callosomarginal, you have got what we call the corpus callosum, which connects the left side of the brain to the right side of the brain. Okay, there's this structure here that to supply that, and then you have got also pericalloso just on top, and then post frontal there. So, but don't worry much about the only thing that I want you to know here is that the anterior aspect of the brain is being supplied by the anterior cerebral. Okay. The middle cerebral has got two divisions. I've got the superior division and the inferior division. The superior division, what is it supplying? Orbitofrontal, prefrontal, and also is giving these branches orbitofrontal, prefrontal, and then precentral and central arteries. So you are basically supplying the frontal lobe. Okay, so some part of the frontal lobe is actually innervated by the middle cerebral, even if others are innervated by the anterior cerebral and also the parietal lobes. The inferior division supplies the temporal lobe, the one that you can see here where your ear is, and the occipital lobe, some part of the occipital lobe, but majority of the occipital is supplied by the the posterior. So damage to the superior division can lead to motor deficits. You can't move well. There are problems in movement. Why? Because of supplying the frontal and especially the parietal lobes. The parietal lobes, that's where you have got actually the frontal lobes. Okay, the one in front. Because in front of the central sulcus, we have got what we call the motor area. So if you can't supply the motor area, there's going to be problem with motor function. The inferior division, you can see we said it supplies the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe contains the Wernicke's area. So if there's an injury here, there's going to be language disturbance. You can't understand language. Probably you can speak, but it will be very hard for you to understand because speech is controlled by the Broca's area that is found in the frontal lobe. Okay. Another branch that comes from the middle cerebral. Now this one is medial. It's in the medial aspect. Are the lenticulostriated arteries. These ones, you can see the areas that they are supplying. This area here on the middle, I've got what we call the basal ganglia. Okay, the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia contains a lot of parts, just so that you can just get an idea. It's a topic on its own. So the basal ganglia has got this nucleus that you can see on top, which you call the caudate nucleus. And then you have got these parts that you can see. These are just two parts. You have got the one that is lateral is a putamen, and then the one that is medial is the globus pallidus. Now the globus pallidus has got two parts. You have got the one that is internal or medial, so medial or internal globus pallidus, and the one that is external or lateral globus pallidus. If you combine the putamen, this one which is lateral, to the caudate, we form what we call the striatum. And then when you combine now the putamen and the globus pallidus, you are going to form what we call the lenticular nucleus. For this part, they'll not ask you any question, but later on they'll ask you questions because you'd have learned the basal ganglia. And then you can see there's this space here. There's this space which is looking white here. We call that as the internal capsule. Okay, the internal capsule. It's basically fibers that are coming from the cerebral cortex going down here to connect to some other parts down. Okay, and medially you can see we have got the thalamus. This is when you are looking at someone from the front, if you cut the brain from the front. But laterally, this is again the basal ganglia. Okay, you can see again the putamen. You can't see here the globus pallidus because it's medial to the putamen, so it's being hidden inside. And then you have got the thalamus inside there that you can see. Okay, so those are the parts. So The lenticulostriated arteries will be able to supply the basal ganglia and then also the globus pallidus. Now, the globus pallidus is part of the basal ganglia. Now, specifically, it is the lateral globus pallidus, not the medial. And then you also have the internal capsule. So this is space that you can, this white space, it will go like, it makes like a V, okay, on the left and on the right. That's the internal capsule. It will also be supplied by this lenticular striated arteries. Specifically, the internal capsule has got the anterior limb, the genu, the posterior limb, the retrolenticular part, and the sublenticular. Now, we'll discuss those and their blood supply later on. But what I want you to understand is that these arteries, these lenticulostriated arteries, which are supplying these to small structures, the basal ganglia and the internal capsule, when they become occluded, there will be no blood supply to these areas, and that leads to what we call the lacuna, stroke, or an infarct. Okay, so there will be motor deficits because the function of the basal ganglia. What happens is this: the cerebral cortex plans. Okay, I need to move my hand. Before you can move your hand, that instruction is going to go to the basal ganglia so that the basal ganglia can be able to modulate it or to tune it so that it will be just enough. Look at, think of this. When you think you are walking, imagine you are walking and then you see a ditch. What you are going to do is that you are going to jump, isn't it? You are going to jump as much as you can. But if you are walking, you didn't know that there is a ditch, and then you suddenly see it, and then you are trying to jump. What will happen is that even when you try to move, your brain already planned that there's no ditch here, so you might not be able to reach at the end, so you might even injure yourself. So the function of the basal ganglia is to regulate, to be able to calculate some error in movement and make sure that that error is accounted for. Okay, how much more? Imagine I gave you 20 liters of a 20 liters bucket. I told you there is water. When you want to lift that 20 liters, what you do is that you are going to come with much force to try to lift it because your brain has already calculated the much energy that you need to use. But imagine you find that there is no water. You are going to lift it so fast and you might even end up injuring yourself because there is no water. Why? Because the brain calculated. And that's the function of the basal ganglia. So if the basal ganglia is not being supplied with blood, it can't control these motor functions. So there's going to be these motor deficits. All right. Okay. So again, we said that the basal ganglia contains parts. You have got the caudate nucleus. The caudate nucleus, we said, is made up of what parts? The caudate nucleus is made up of the striatum and the, okay, the caudate itself is just alone. But when you combine caudate and putamen, that's what forms the striatum. But what I want you to know is that that caudate is supplied by the reticulostriated artery, which is coming from the middle cerebral. It is that reticulostriated artery gives what we call the, okay, no. So this reticulostriated is not coming from the middle cerebral, but from the anterior cerebral. So for this one, it's the one that is coming from the anterior cerebral artery. So look at this. This picture that we can see here is showing us this branch, is showing us some of these branches coming out. You can see which are supplying the putamen and the globus pallidus. Okay, you also have, can you see this branch, this gamma branch coming here? That is the anterior cerebral. So this anterior cerebral is giving this gamma artery here. You can see this gamma artery. That's the recurrent artery of Hebner. So this is the one that we are looking at. Okay, this is the artery that we are looking at. And then you also have these ones here. You can see these ones here, the reticulostriated arteries. These are the ones that are coming from the middle cerebral. So specifically, an important one you need to know that is that the caudate nucleus is going to be supplied by the recurrent artery of Ebner, which comes from the middle cerebral via the reticulostriated. So the anterior cerebral also give you the reticulostriated, and then that will give you this recurrent artery of Hebner that will supply the caudate. Putamen and globus pallidus will also be supplied by the reticular striatum, but these ones are coming from where? Cerebral. But let me just differentiate this again. Reticular striatum is coming from the cerebral, but the recurrent artery of Hebner is coming from the anterior cerebral. Please just differentiate those two. Okay. This one, anterior cerebral giving you recurrent artery of Hebner, and then cerebral is giving you the reticular striatum. So caudate will be supplied by both. And then putamen and globus pallidus, which are also part, okay, which are also part. The putamen here and the globus, these three structures here, these guys will be supplied by reticulostriate and also the anterior choroid. Another part of the basal ganglia is what we call the subthalamic nucleus. It will be supplied by posterior cerebral artery. And the substantia nigra is also another part which will also be supplied by the posterior cerebral. So all in all, what should you know very much of importance here? Take note that caudate is supplied by the cerebral via the reticular striate and by the anterior cerebral via the recurrent artery of Ebner. And then the putamen and globus pallidus, these guys are supplied by the cerebral artery via the reticular striate and the anterior choroidal, which comes direct from the internal carotid. Okay. And anatomy people are so interesting. This diagram can come. This diagram you can see here. So this artery you can see in front here is the anterior cerebral, and you can see the anterior cerebral is giving. So this artery from where the anterior cerebral is coming, this was the internal carotid, and you can see before the internal carotid can actually become anterior cerebral, you're having this one in green, which is the anterior choroidal, and you can see the anterior choroidal is supplying this green part here. This is the tail or the caudate nucleus. And then you are having this one, the anterior cerebral, giving you this recurrent artery of Ebner, okay, which is still supplying the caudate, but this is specifically the head of the caudate. And then the neck of the caudate on the middle here, and including also the globus pallidus, you can see it's being supplied by the reticular striate. So the caudate itself, very big, like this structure here. The caudate nucleus is very big because it contains the tail, contains the neck, and the head. So the neck is via the lenticular striate from the cerebral. The tail is anterior choroidal. The head is via the recurrent artery of Hebner. Okay. For the thalamus, the blood supply, okay, just know you have got the posterior communicating and the posterior cerebral. I think that's all. And then for the internal capsule, this is again another important part. Internal capsule contains, this is the internal capsule here. It contains what we call the anterior limb, the posterior limb. Now connecting the anterior limb to the posterior limb, we have got what we call the genu. And then we have got the sublentiform part and the retrorentiform part, which is at the very end. Okay. So what should you know here? Please, it's very important for you to know here. This is the basilar artery. This is the posterior cerebral. So can you see that from the posterior cerebral is going to supply three parts of the internal capsule: the retrorentiform part, the sublentiform part, and the posterior limb. Okay, three parts. And then this one is the posterior communicating. This is the internal capsule. This one. So sorry, the internal carotid. The internal carotid, this one which is making a cell. Can you see posterior? It gives the anterior choroidal. The anterior choroidal supplies two parts: the sublentiform part and the posterior limb. And then there's an artery that comes direct from the middle. There's an artery that comes direct from the internal capsule. So a direct branch supplies the genu. Okay, a direct branch from the internal capsule supplies the genu. And then you have got now again, you can see you have got the cerebral. This one is the cerebral. The middle cerebral is again going to supply three parts: the posterior limb, the genu, and the anterior limb. You see it looks trick, right? Multiple choice a lot from here. And then when you go again forward, you have got the anterior cerebral. There's a branch that coming direct from the anterior cerebral that is supplying the anterior limb. Just think of anterior cerebral, anterior limb. So that's a striate branch that is supplying the anterior limb. And then again, you have got another branch that is supplying. So the recurrent branch of the anterior cerebral, this is the recurrent artery of Hebner, supplying the anterior limb and the genu. So what do I want you to know here? The recurrent branch of Hebner supplies the anterior limb and the genu. And then we have got this striate branch which will only supply the anterior limb. Take note that the middle cerebral supplies three parts: anterior, genu, and posterior. And then the posterior, so what supplies three parts? The middle cerebral supplies three parts. The posterior cerebral also supplies three parts. But for the posterior to be supplying those parts that are posterior, the retrolentiform part, sublentiform part, and the posterior limb. The anterior choroid supplies two parts: sublentiform and posterior limb. A direct branch of the internal carotid will supply the genu. So that is a blood supply to the internal capsule. Is that okay? Can I see some reactions if we are following so far? Okay, very good. Don't forget this, guys. Don't forget. Don't forget middle cerebral supplying three parts, posterior cerebral supplying three parts, anterior choroid supplying two parts. You have also a direct branch, and then a recurrent artery of Ebner supplying also the anterior limb and the genu. Don't forget that. Okay. This is also just showing the same things that we've said. The straight branch only supplies the anterior limb. Recurrent artery of Hebner supplies anterior limb and the genu. And then the straight branch of the middle cerebral. You can see the middle cerebral supply the anterior limb, the genu, and the posterior limb. You have the direct branch from the anterior cerebral, which one supplies the genu. Anterior choroid supplies the posterior limb and the sublentiform part. The posterior cerebral supplies three parts: posterior limb, sublentiform, and retrorentiform. Okay, those are the supplies. And then the blood supply to the cerebellum, as we said, you have got two that to supply the inferior part, that will be the posterior inferior cerebellar, anterior inferior cerebellar. So I've got ICA and PICA supplying the down part of the cerebellum. And then the superior cerebellar also will be supplied by one artery. That is it about the blood supply to the brain. Is there any question about the blood supply to the brain before I talk about the blood supply to the spinal cord?